Hey folks, it's Smooth checking in. I've been asked to do a tutorial for the Glock pistol, something that can be used for disassembly in the field when you have no tools. As always, firearms sometimes have bullets in them, so you always check. Make sure you look down in the barrel, right here, look through. Make sure there's nothing in there. When you check it, cycle the firearm, lock it open, check it again. And as always, we triple check to make sure that it's not loaded. There's two ways that you can get the top piece off, with the trigger forward or with the trigger back. With the trigger forward, you're going to grab the top and the back and pull them together until you get about a 1/4 inch of clearance where it is slidden back. You're going to pull these two tabs down, which pulls the bar down, which releases the top piece. Pushing your thumb on the back, you'll notice that it's not coming off because your trigger assembly has caught it. So at this point, while still holding it back, you're going to pull the trigger and it's going to release it so it can come off. I don't recommend doing it that way. I've seen a lot of people do it that way, but it can mess up the internal pieces, cause them to fatigue. Preferred method, make sure that it's unloaded, pull the trigger, and you're going to do a very similar thing. You're going to pull the top back so that you're getting about a 1/4 inch here. You'll feel it unlock. Reach on this bar, both sides, pull them down, push the bar forward. Should slide right apart with no trouble. What we're going to do here is we're going to try to take this thing all the way apart without using any tools, so that we can demonstrate that it can be done in the field if it has to be. We're going to start with the top. The guide spring here, the guide rod, you just pull it to the side and remove it. This barrel is not OEM, so we're going to have to remove the thread protector before we can remove it. But it comes out the same way an OEM barrel would come out. You push it from the bottom, slides out, and you can grab it, just pull it out. Set those aside. Right here, this little tab is the back of your striker. And in front of it, you're going to notice that there's a small plastic sleeve or cylinder that's inside here. We're going to need to pull that sleeve forward to the forward of the pistol so that it'll release the tension on the back plate so that it can be removed. This is a little tricky without tools, so we're going to have to look to what we have. Right here on the very front of the Glock pistol, there's two small points. You can use whichever one's more comfortable for you, but you're going to put it in there and grab that black sleeve and then pull it down. It's only going to move about 1/8 of an inch, but it's all it needs to relieve that tension. So I'm going to try to do that now. Once you get it, your back plate is going to start sliding off, and you're going to have to maintain a good bit of pressure back here to keep your internal parts from shooting out and taking off away from you. When you remove the back plate, you'll feel both those points, and if you slowly release the tension, they should just sit there and not go flying away. You can remove your striker assembly, which is your firing pin, spring, and its housing. And then you have the extractor, depressor, plunger spring, which is 3 pieces. By removing those, you're now going to be able to push down on this small piece, which is your firing pin safety. And when you push that down, your extractor, the round indicator, is going to fall out. Turn that over and tap out your firing pin safety. That removes everything with the sights and a small plastic sleeve out of here that is pointless to remove. So we're going to set that aside. These three pieces are compound pieces. They're made up of multiple smaller pieces. Your firing pin safety has a small spring. In order to remove that spring, you're going to want to twist the spring and push it into the main piece in such a fashion that it's going to cause the spring to reduce in size. It's going to free it from the small ledge that it's kept on the inside. Your extractor depressor plunger spring has a small plastic piece in the end, which you can remove. It has a small spring, which if you twist it so that it expands the springs, the opposite way of before, it should release. Your striker assembly is made up of several small pieces. There's two keepers, the striker itself, a spring, and then the small housing and guide that fits into the top piece. This piece has a fair amount of tension, so you want to be careful when you're doing this not to shoot pieces away from you and lose them. If you lose pieces in the field by springing them off, it's a high likelihood that you're not going to find them, and your nice pistol is now nothing more than a paperweight. The best way to get this keeper out, there's two of them, and to remove this is by placing the back of the plastic piece squarely on the base of your first knuckle. You're going to reach around and grab the springs so that when you push down with your other hand, you can pinch that spring and secure it. At this point, you can pull the spring forward, and you'll notice the keepers fall right off. So when you do that, you want to be careful not to lose them. Slowly relieve the pressure here off of the spring. You can slide that off, and you can remove the guide and the housing, and you're left with just the striker. That completely takes care of the entire top half. For the bottom piece, we've got three pins that we need to remove. The best way I've found to do this is by taking your extractor depressor and starting the plastic spring in the back. Then you can take the tip of the same piece, the small plastic piece, and set it plumb in the hole. You don't want to set it sideways so that you're going to bend this piece. You want to keep it straight and apply slow but direct pressure until it drives the pin through the other side. So now you can remove that piece, set it aside, and you're going to grab the plastic pin and pull it through. Set that down. Now, with this piece, you've got two more pins here, and you're basically graduating up from one to the next. If you have this thing sitting square on something, you try to drive the pins down, they're not going to be able to come back out the other side, so it's going to resist you. If you take your top piece and flip it over so that this space here, or this space here, or even here, depending on how you choose to do it, will give you a space as a workbench where that pen can now travel through. So if you can secure this here and grab your plastic pen that you just extracted and your barrel. Now, this isn't the best idea in the world all the time, but if it's an emergency and it's all you have, these are the tools that you have. You're going to use the top of your barrel at the back, at the beginning of the breech, as a small hammer. You're going to plumb up your pin, not with your main pin, but with the small one above it. You're going to line those pieces up, get everything level, and give it a couple quick little taps, making sure that every time that it's hit, it's square and plumb, and with little trouble it's going to drive the other pin through. So you basically used your plastic pin as a slave pin to drive the other pin through, and you can remove them both with little effort. You're going to set aside your plastic pin. You now have a small metal pin, so you've upgraded your tool. You can now apply the same technique with the metal pin applied to your main pin, making sure everything is all plumb, and give it a couple taps. It accomplishes the same goal. You can set aside your small pin. You may now remove your main pin. In so doing, it completely releases your slide catch. Your slide catch can be turned around and used as a tool to extract your slide catch that's on the front of the block. You can depress the small metal lever that's inside, keeping sure that this piece is kept up. When you do, you can pull that piece out the other side. I'm not going to remove it all the way. There's rarely a reason to, unless you're replacing a broken piece. But you can pull that straight out, and then to put it back in, use the same tool. Push that small metal tab back in, sliding the piece over top of it so that the spring is underneath of this bar, giving it this tension. But for now, I'm just going to slide that back in. It's not going to disrupt the further removal of the rest of the working pieces. In order to remove your main blocking piece, if you grab this tab on your trigger bar and pull it up slightly, it's going to pull up your bar for you. You can also put one of your pins in one of your pin holes and torque on it, but that may bend the pin, so I wouldn't recommend doing that. At this point, you can just slide the block out and set it aside. Note, if you're unfamiliar with these things, the orientation or the way that you're pulling them out, you may want to arrange your pieces in such a fashion as like the order that they were removed. I'm not doing that. I'm familiar with where all of these things go, but if you're doing this for the first time, you may want to put them in little groups, or maybe label what they are on a piece of paper under them as you're going along, until you're familiar enough with them that somebody could shake these up in the dark in a hat and you could be blindfolded and put a pistol together. Your next piece is your trigger assembly, which from that plastic piece that you removed earlier, you can now grab the front of this pen and pull the whole piece out. There's a small metal pin inside of here that if you were to pull up would release your magazine catch. There's no real need to ever take that off unless you're replacing a faulty piece, but if you need to, you can take one of your pins from earlier, your striker, you can move that bar over and then just push this piece out and it'll just fall out for you. We don't need to do that, because you don't need to do that to clean it. Glock doesn't even recommend that you disassemble their pistols this far for cleaning. This is just an example of where they're in an extreme situation and you needed to take it apart for whatever reason. You would be able to with the tools that you have here. Your trigger assembly has your trigger bar, your main piece that houses all of this. There's a small spring in here, and there's a small tab here which regulates the pressure that it's going to take to trip this thing so that it drops. This one happens to be a 2.5 pound trigger that I put in here. If we look at the way that this is oriented with your trigger, like you were to be using it, you want to make sure that when you take it apart, you keep it in this orientation and vary slightly from there. Because if you start bending on it one way or the other, you're going to ruin these pieces. You want to be very careful. The way you're going to take this apart is by pulling it up slightly and then over, and you're going to notice this small tab right here is going to come out. When that tab comes out, you can bend it forward. Now, notice it's completely released. The only thing holding it there is that pin, or that spring rather. That spring needs to be oriented in this fashion so that when you go to take it apart and put it together, all you need to do is find that open end and slide the piece out. You can slide the piece right back in, and it's ready to be put back together. You'll notice when I'm moving this, I'm not turning it, I'm not flipping it backwards, I'm not pulling it down. I'm operating it up and back so that it's moving in the same direction that it would be moving if you were to be firing it. You'll notice how that action is reversing that spring for you. That's going to make it to where it's easier to take apart. You remove your trigger and trigger bar. Now your spring here, all you should have to do is pull up on it, because that opening is in the bottom. You don't want to have it to where you have to hook it, because when you place it on there and it gets reversed, it hooks itself. So if you have those pieces upside down, it could cause you some trouble later. The final piece is this bar, which governs the torque that it's going to take to actually operate our pistol, which you'll see you can remove without any tools. You know, if you're out in the field, you're going to have some fingernails anyway. And that's a complete disassembly of a Glock with no tools. Now we're going to put it back together. Same principles are going to apply. We're going to use the same pieces as the tools the same way we did before. Now, in putting it back together, it helps if you do it in a similar fashion as you took it apart. Similar order. There's a reason that it goes in the order that it does, because you have to graduate your tools as you go, and you need certain tools to accomplish certain things. Now, if you're at this point and this retention bar here is removed, that's going to be the first thing you want to do, because if you find yourself in a position where your slide catch has already been installed in the pistol and you still need to install this, you're going to have to take it all back apart and come all the way back to this point so that you can depress that one pin and put that piece in, and that's going to piss you off. So what you're going to want to do is make sure, first and foremost, that this piece that we didn't pull all the way out earlier, that we decided to leave in, if you have decided to take it out, this is the time where you need to decide to put it back in. Once that piece is in and you make sure that it's working, the next step is to reassemble your trigger and put your trigger in. First step. So what we're going to need to do is find that main piece that sits in the back, that houses and blocks everything. We're going to need to make sure that we have our tension bar, and we're going to install that. Make sure that you find, if you put it on this way, it's not even going to go in the hole all the way. You're going to notice that this side has a groove that's cut out, and if you're not matching that groove, it's on the wrong side. You don't want it to be where the piece is stuck out here, because that's going to conflict with the housing. You want to make sure that you're facing the direction that has this groove. You're going to make sure that when you push this piece in, it should seat rather easily. Some of them are a little tight. The more that you do this, the looser they'll get for you, or the more apt your fingers will be to take them apart. That piece should be relatively flush, small protrusion, but that's because it has to flex slightly. It governs the torsion. Now we're going to take that piece, and on the side opposite of this pin, which is going to be back here, we're going to put our spring back on. Now it's important that this opening on the spring be facing the piece that you're putting it on in a downward fashion. You don't want it to be to where you're applying it this way. You want it to be where you're applying it this way. In so doing, like we said, when this thing gets put together, this spring is not going to be facing the back. It's going to be facing the front, kind of like this. And that spring will then be hooked, even though it's not at this point. You're going to take this tip right here. Notice how springs open on opposite ends. It's on the bottom on this side and it's on the top on this side. Remember how we talked about the orientation of this pistol bar, this trigger bar, not being upside down or backwards, but being in line. This small piece right here that has a small groove in it and a small hole is for the trigger spring here. You're going to take those pieces, slide them in. See how it catches the spring? Now, remember how we said about how it was this movement here and not any of this craziness, but smooth and straight? This spring needs to sit in that middle crevice. So you're going to put it in there, just like that. Notice that it's slightly bent because you need to get this bar in this small hole. So you're going to twist it slightly and put that piece in. Now, this piece may or may not line up for you when you do that. You'll see how that's sitting up close to this top bar. It actually needs to be under the small one at the back. It'll hold itself there with a little bit of tension. See how it comes forward? Just like that. That's the action your trigger's taking when you fire. It's releasing that, which is dropping this plate, which catches the back of your striker. That when you pull the trigger, it allows that to move forward. When you put this piece back in, you need to make sure that that piece is forward and locked in. And when you get it there, you're going to hold it with your fingers so that it's locked tight. You're going to insert the trigger into the trigger well, because if you do the back first, the trigger may not go in. So if you insert the trigger first and then hook the back of the trigger assembly in, it should slide right in. Just make sure you give it a little snug push, make sure it's seated in there well. Then you're going to go back and find, of your 3 pins that you removed, your plastic pin. Your plastic pin was the first one you removed, but it's also going to be the first one you put back in. You insert your plastic pin, get it as far as you can with your fingers or whatever, and then you can use your striker to seat it the rest of the way so it doesn't protrude on either side. Now your trigger's been put back in. Your trigger assembly, the housing, the release, this piece needs to be in. You're ready at this point to put the block back in. The block should only go in, either backwards, where this piece is sticking up, and that's going to cause a conflict, or if you turn that around and put it so that it's going to line up with that main pin, and that the other pin's going to be able to slide through it. When you align the block correctly, it should slide right in, and it should seat in such a fashion that it's not going to conflict with the rails. Make sure everything's nice and smooth. Now, you need to retain your block, and you've got 2 pins to do it, your main spring and a smaller spring. You're going to want to use the smaller spring first, because the smaller spring is going to act as a bar when you go to put your slide catch back in that catches this spring as you put it in. If you put the main spring, or if you put the main pin in first, it's going to secure your slide catch, but this spring right here is going to be sitting high, and when you go to install your other spring or your other pin, it's going to hit this spring, and you're going to have to hold that down with like a needle, in order to hold that pin down. So in order to avoid that future conflict, we're going to resolve this and secure this piece by installing the smaller of the 2 springs first, or the 2 pins first. If you need to, you can use your barrel to tap your pins in. You can carefully use the tip of your striker to seat it so that it's smooth, so that it's flush on both sides. You don't want any pins sticking out. Now you'll notice that where you're going to be putting your slide catch in is going to be in this furthermost groove to this side. It actually sits beside the trigger. It sits underneath of that pin that we just installed, the small metal one. You'll see that this has a hole right here, which when you slide it in, it's going to line up with this hole. And you'll see where this hole right here is for the other pin. When we put this in, it's going to hold that spring underneath of that other pin, which is where it needs to be, which is what's going to give us our tension so that it doesn't lock the pistol open all the time. If you put it together and every time you fire it locks open, it's because this spring is sitting on top of this bar and not underneath of it. So that would be effectively holding this thing up with upward tension instead of holding it down with downward tension, so that it only comes up when this small tab on the front of an empty magazine comes up and catches that piece, causes it to rise, and locks the thing open on the last expenditure of the final round. So we can take our catch here and we can find that furthermost slit that's all the way to this side of the trigger, making sure that the spring is in line, because if it's sitting beside it, it's not going to go in for you. So I'm going to have to turn this away from you so I can see to line it up. When that goes in, you're going to notice that you can't quite see through this hole all the way. This spring here, this catch, you're going to have to push it slightly forward. It'll want to sit slightly back. There's about 1/4 to 1/8 of an inch of play there. You should be able to see it. You're going to want to push it forward so that this piece right here is lined up with that hole. Now, because that first pin's already there, we don't have to worry about that small spring. It automatically lines up, and we can take our main pin and reinsert it into the bottom hole there. If you need to twist it and jiggle it, you can. This one's pretty smooth because she's fresh. Some of the older pistols that are more worn out, maybe have been through the meat grinder, you're going to need a tool. You can use your barrel. You can use the top end if you don't want to affect your barrel. Either way, it affects the same purpose. You can use your striker, or you can use your depressor pin, to make sure that that one's level in there. At this point, you should be able to push your trigger bar forward, and your trigger should lock. You'll notice that the safety on the trigger has to be depressed in order for the trigger to move backwards. You want to make sure that that is functioning properly, and make sure that the trigger remains depressed. You don't want it to be locked forward when you're trying to put it together, because you're going to have a confliction with the pieces. So make sure that's rear. We're going to set this aside for now, and we're going to return to the top piece. The top piece, we're going to start by reassembling the compound pieces that we had from earlier. Our firing pin safety and spring, we're going to reassemble. This thing that looks like a chess pawn is your firing pin safety. It will not allow your striker to move forward unless you pull on the trigger and the trigger moves to the rear. That's going to actually cause this bar to push this forward, lining this groove up so that this bar can move forward. That's why they call it the safe action, triple action safety system for Glock. You should be able to throw it off of a building, so they say, and it not fire. When you push the spring back in, you don't want to just set it in there. You want it to actually lock. There's a small groove on the inside of this hole that runs around the bottom. And in order to get that to lock, you're going to need to take your spring, put it in there, and apply pressure to it and turn it in such a fashion that it's going to cause the spring to shrink in size, to collapse, which is counterclockwise on this spring. So we're going to push in and turn counterclockwise and keep pushing in until we feel a click. You can hear the click. Now that piece is secure, you should actually be able to pull on it quite a bit and it not come out. You want it to be like that, or it's not right. This is the first piece that you're going to be putting back in. It lines up with the bigger of these two holes here, the only one that that'll fit through, and you put it in spring first. And make sure that you push it down, and when you push it down that it travels freely, and that you're able to see this groove free up on the other side.